Una prova. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, can I be heard? Yes, thank you. Excellent. Hope you come back all rested and refreshed from the break. I would like to start this session on what is known in the program, at least, as the Deep Maghreb, or the Sahel to others. That is an issue that I already have on my agenda to raise. Traditionally, the Sahel has been, at least in geopolitical international terms, has been pretty much of a backwater in the past. And certainly when I became familiar with the region in the 1990s, there was just the beginnings of an independence movement as a WED for the Tuaregs in Mali, which in 2012 erupted into conflict, and since then has only worsened, and it has become the victim of the already endemic problems of poverty in the region, increasing desertification, and the introduction of new global actors, particularly on the Islamist agenda with Al-Qaeda and Islamic State making a presence in the country. And the interaction between ideologically motivated groups with transnational and organized crime has created a very toxic mix, which has now made this region to be one of the growing regions when it comes to instability and increasing violence. The prospects for the future are incredibly bleak as well, not only for the G5 countries, which we are looking at mostly today, but some of the countries that are neighboring on the G5 countries. So it's something that is very timely, that is on our agenda today. And I'm happy that we have a very distinguished group of experts who will cover both areas, both the geopolitical aspects of the conflict as well as the transnational and more criminal aspects of the conflict and the instability. I'd like to begin with Dr. Bakary Sambe, who is director of the Timbuktu Institute of the African Center for Peace Studies in Dakar, Senegal. He's assistant professor at Gaston Berger University in Saint Louis, Senegal, and an expert for the UN, the EU, the AU, on the implementation of the G5 Sahel regional program for combating and preventing radicalization, as well as the author of several books and articles on Islamist movements in Morocco, Nigeria, and Senegal. Dr. Sambe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the NATO Defense College for organizing this meeting and for giving African voices to a discussion on Arab geopolitics. This is, I think, a fair reparation for the long-standing mistake made by contemporary geopolitics, which believed in a divide between the Maghreb and sub-Saharan Africa, contrary to historical and cultural realities. The Sahel means, above all in Arabic, a Sahel, the river, the other side of the great desert. The Sahara Desert have never been an impassable barrier, but a real inland sea that has always invited people to move from one shore to another shore, and that for during centuries. Until Nicolas Sarkozy attempts to set up a union for the Mediterranean, the dominant geopolitical thinking focus on the link with the northern shores of the Mediterranean. While one Arab in three is an African, quarter of the Arab world's territories are on the African continent. The first mistake was made when terrorist groups appeared in North African societies. It was to be expected that they would spread south of the Sahara in view of the historical and geopolitical continuum. The outbreak of the Libyan conflict was a wake-up call, but that showed that the problems of this region should be analyzed with a view to the larger picture. I come here with three questions. The first one is, how the Western partners can make up for 40 years of delay compared to the network we try to combat there. The second question is, what did we miss together? And the last one is, what we can co-construct. How to make up for 40 years of delay? I mentioned the effect of the drought in the 17th, with the instability of international partners, inability of international partners to assist drought-affected Sahelian countries. The partners, Western partners themselves, at the same time was hit by the financial and oil crisis. And in this time, we have the rise of the oil-producing countries, which have a Sahel strategy with two pillars, da'wah and ighatha, preaching and humanitarian aid. And there is a kind of substitution for the state to provide basic social services and a large-scale preaching campaigns. So the international community have a first misjudgment. The international community did not understand the stake of such a rupture, imposing structural adjustment policies on Sahelian and other African countries, weakening of states that can no longer provide basic social services. And the result, number one, was that the Sahel strategy of oil-producing countries with da'wah and ighatha, they have a strong position in the educational and social field to the point of competing strongly with the states. And now we are in a kind of a status of statu quo favorable to the state competitor. Religious actors are identified as privileged interlocutor. They have the monopoly of the religious discourse that is meaningful for the population compared to democracy, to human rights, and everything. They take advantage of the weakness of the state, which faces the challenge of the state deficit. What did we miss together? It is time, I think, to give dignity of solutions to indigenous possibility and strategies. The Sahelian stalemate that is emerging from the old military option is coupled with a dilemma. This new Sahelian dilemma lies in the difficult position of state of the region and their international partners. In the solution proposed to fight terrorism, we have almost lost our sense of priority. We have reached a point where we are faced with a profound question between the imperative of managing security emergencies and the need for a change of paradigm in the face of the obvious failure of the old military approach. In the meantime, now, when we talk about what has happened in Afghanistan, the Afghan laboratory, as I said, have produced a new Taliban variant and a new concept, which is soft jihadism. The victory, now I want to give the perception from the local population in the Sahel about what happened in Afghanistan. The victory of the Taliban seems to act as the birth of a narrative, an inspiring and mobilizing storytelling about the possibility of establishing an internationally recognized Islamic State in the 21st century. This is both a psychological and political achievement that will galvanize Sahelian Islamic movement far from the valley of Afghanistan and the Arab world, despite all the debate of the reproduction of the Afghan scenario. The tacit Western recognition gives it even more brilliance. The media resonance of this takeover, as well as surge of solidarity that accompanied it in the Muslim world, were reinforced by the pragmatic shift for a West that succumbed to the sirens of diplomatic realism, while allowing the Taliban de facto to be internationally acceptable. The Western powers are in the logic of never wanting to cede the ground of new friendship with the Kabul regime to Chinese or to the Russian rivals. While the idea of soft jihadism is now a given, and the Afghan laboratory have produced a new Taliban variant that seems to have succeeded in its ideological facelift, allowing it to forge all forms of alliance in the West and as well in the Muslim world that will follow the irreversible movement of normalization. However, Beyond this observation, enormous questions arise about the credibility in the Sahel among our people, as in the rest of the world, of the fight of extremism and terrorism, when the values that underpin it are now sacrificed on the altar of strategic interests, and I can say immediate interests. Now, what can we co-construct? And it's my final word. The solution in the Sahel will necessarily be co-constructed or will not be found soon. In view of the failure of solitary military initiatives such as Serval and Barkhane, there is a need for more strategy, more synergy, and NATO should initiate this collective reflection in view of the issue at stake, which are transforming the Sahel into a new area for the great game to come. The combination of these new factors will further complicate the Sahelian question. While Libya is far from finding peace, the Russian influence, Chinese ambitions, and the emergence of a new power such as Turkey, in addition to the Moroccan and Algerian rivalry. The Sahel, I can say, need everyone, but together. First of all, what we can do together. I think that the work of counter-narrative, for which the United Arab Emirates and Egypt are quite ahead, alongside Morocco, which has developed a vast training program for imam. The deconstruction of jihadism Salafist, for which Saudi Arabia could have some legitimacy, for a reason you can understand. The experience in the fights against terrorist group with Algeria and its leadership within the African Union. NATO, which must better highlight its weight and capacity to build synergies that will be more legitimate than solitary initiative on the part of classic partners who must each time face the difficulty of managing the emergency and history at the same time. But once again, we must break with the idea of putting intermediaries between partners such as NATO, the Gulf state, and indigenous initiative in the Sahel. I see the title is the Deep Maghreb. Okay, we can be the Deep Maghreb, but we are the Sahel. And we can take into account the strategy developed in the Sahel, and which are sometimes rarely highlighted. As much as we are looking for partners, tutelage will not help us move forward on the road of to peace. Thank you for your kind attention. And I'm sorry for my very basic and Francophone English.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sambe. A lot of interesting points that I hope that we will have time to discuss at the end, particularly what you so ironically termed the Afghan laboratory. And I think the NATO withdrawal from Afghanistan, even though it's not in our region, will have a huge impact on different independence movements, ideological movements, whether they be Islamist-based or otherwise, and something that will really have a huge impact. But I think also the great game has already come to the Sahel, and you talked about this, the lack of attention over the last 40 years, which I think I mentioned in my introduction as well, and I fully agree with you. And I think now, increasingly, we are seeing that that attention is coming because the great game has moved. I'd like to introduce now my second speaker, Dr. Claudia Gazzini, who is a Syria-Libya analyst at the International Crisis Group.
Only Libya.
Yeah, only Libya. But she has very bravely decided to spend a great deal of her time in Libya itself, which I think is extremely important for the kind of work that she's doing. She has been working with ICG since 2012 and worked from 2017 to 2018 as a policy advisor to Ghassan Salameh, the special representative of the Secretary General of the UN in Libya, and as well has worked as a journalist for the AP in Rome and Reuters in Jakarta. Claudia.
Thank you. Exactly a year ago, rival Libyan factions that were at war signed a ceasefire agreement. the parties at war, and I'm talking about the Haftar-led Libyan National Army with its backers, Egypt, the UAE, Russia, and to a certain and partial degree, France. And on the other side, the Tripoli-based authorities, at the time led by Faiz Sarraj, with its international backers, mainly Turkey and Qatar, signed a ceasefire agreement that officially ended a war that de facto had ended several months before, and was supposed to pave the way to unifying the country's military institutions and unifying the country, and forcing the departure of foreign forces and mercenaries that had taken part in this war. In a certain respect, there was hope that what would follow in the following months and following year, we would see an end of the battle for Libya, that battle between regional states that had been using Libya as a proxy terrain. What I want to tell you now is probably something obvious, but it's that battle for Libya has never ended. Yes, we have no longer a war, and since I work for a conflict prevention organization, this is good news. But the battle for influence of Libya's future is in full stream, completely underway. We're still seeing, and what do I mean by the battle for Libya? I mean that those regional powers and foreign stakeholders that had actively been part of the war for the control of Tripoli in 2019 and early 2020 are still indirectly trying to influence the course of events by influencing the political roadmap, by pursuing, to a certain sense, a unilateral security strategy in Libya and business and economic deals. Who are these? But unlike during the war, it was a very bipolar situation. You had a pro-Haftar coalition, mainly of Arab capitals, and then you had a pro-Tripoli coalition with Turkey at its helm because they intervened militarily on the ground officially to help Tripoli and Qatar. Now it's less bipolar, this rivalry for the battle and the control of Libya. It's more like, it's no longer a tug of war. It's more like a Gordian knot where you have several ropes stemming out of it and powers that are pulling in different directions. Yes, you still have Egypt / UAE / Gulf axis that is trying to influence Libya's future by pushing and supporting sort of unilateral election laws that would enable and favor a political outcome if indeed Libya goes to elections at the end of this year or the beginning of next year, that would see the coming to power of a strong, centralized president, which is very much an aspiration of Cairo and other Gulf countries that like this figure, this idea of a strong figurehead for the country. On the other side, you still have a pro-Turkey coalition, which is more silent in influencing the course of political events. It's not maneuvering to have legislation come out in one way or another, but it's still very much present on the ground with military deals. It's actively training military forces. Likewise, Egypt continues to have bilateral ties in supporting Haftar-led forces. Russia is the third rope, officially during the war part of the pro-Haftar coalition. But Russia's now strategy in Libya is to consolidate its presence, refuse the removal of its private security contractors that are present in Libya. I think the big novelty is that before, Russia was denying having an official role in the deployment of Wagner, and now it's taking credit for it, and therefore it's proposing itself as a sort of official stakeholder that has to be dealt with when talking about the removal of foreign forces. You have the US, that is the most vocal in trying to pursue elections, and the mantra of US officials is, we need elections because only through elections we will have a new legitimate government. A new legitimate government that can then pursue military unification, economic unification, and have its own standing vis-a-vis the world. But it's a US, which speakers before me said, has relatively speaking less credibility given what has happened in Afghanistan. So they talk the talk, but the question that Libyans have is, do they walk the walk as well? And part of this sort of US policy group, I would place most European countries as well. The Sahel and African countries are nowhere to be seen. So it's really not a battle for the Deep Maghreb or of the Sahel countries in Libya. The AU has always been trying to claim a role in the Libya peace process and has been nowhere, doesn't have the capacity. And there are Arab countries that are pushing the AU out, saying this is an Arab country, Libya is our brother, we do not want the Africans to deal with Libya. And so Libya is still at the center of this very strong power struggle. And we're at a moment where things could go very much wrong if we don't have a resolution to this political roadmap that is supposed to culminate with the elections. So far, what has kept the country at bay, meaning not in active war, is the fact that there's very little regional appetite to go back to war, but the tensions are resurfacing. So to conclude, where does this leave NATO? NATO is nowhere, to be honest. NATO is absolutely nowhere in Libya. It was there in 2011, very much so, very forcefully. But when you ask what has NATO done in these last few years, at best, it's to offer a security evacuation plan for the UN from Tripoli, should problems arise. At best, it's a place Libyan officials and successive Libyan governments have gone to talk about security cooperation. But NATO is nowhere at the moment. So if NATO wants to help resolve or cut the Gordian knot of these tensions that are still lingering and the battle for Libya, it needs to do some soul searching, which will not be easy because of French-Turkish tensions, but it's there to be resolved. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Essa Gazzini. It's nice to know that the struggle, or the open war, at least in Libya, is over. But as you say, the struggle for influence and power in Libya is still very much going on. And the civil war in Libya had a tremendous impact on the conflict that grew in the Sahel region. And so there's obviously a huge concern about what happens in Libya, staying in Libya and not having an impact. But we all know that it will have an impact. And the battle for Libya has a great impact, not just for Libya itself, but for the greater Sahel region. I'd like to turn now to my guest to the left, Dr. Ernesto Savona, who is the director of Transcrime at the Università Cattolica Milano. He is a professor of criminology and a member of several expert groups for data on crime, as well as being a consultant to the UN, the EU, and the Council of Europe on these important issues of criminology. And we count very much on you, Dr. Savona, to give us some insight into the origins and impact of trans-criminality and organized crime on the conflict in the Sahel.
Thanks, Robert. Let me congratulate with Ambassador Minuto Luzzo for this very well organized conference, and more for inviting me here, which is quite relevant. What I'm trying to do is answering to the main question of the conference, what strategies, resources, and forces should be employed to avoid a major regional collapse in Sahel. Using the results of a recent research project, FLOWS, funded by PMI Impact, we have delivered on the end of July. So the report is on the website, I will mention on the end, and it's available for everybody. In 7 minutes, I will try to explain what we have done and how this could be relevant for the discussion we do have today about illicit trade in North Africa and Sahel. We have been using 2 key words, displacement and convergence of crime. Displacement means when crimes go from one side to the other because of an intervention done by police or legislator. Human smuggling is a case. You intervene in an area and they move to another area. Drugs are also a good example. And when we speak about Sahel, where we have 11 countries, this is the real good example, it's in column, of relationships between the fragility of the state and the development of illicit trade and organized crime, which means when you go and look to the situation, which is quite different from one country to another country, you see that more illicit trade you have, more fragility they provoke, more fragility you have, more illicit trade you have. So the 2 things come circular one with the other. And this is very relevant because you need to know from where you stop. You increase the institutions or you combat illicit trade, both how, when, in which territories. But let me explain these 2 key concepts, crime displacement. You have a special in the area, you have from crime to crime. There are many typologies of crime displacement. It means you move crime from one place to the other. Many regulators or legislators try to move the crime from one place to the other. Crime convergence, what does it mean? When 2 forms of crime converge one with the other. That means the territory has been abandoned and in the hands of criminals. So you have a lot of opportunities for criminals. Let me go there on what are the main findings of these projects. We have pointed out 12 main findings. The first is asymmetries. This is really relevant in terms of crime displacement when you have a country which is intervening on a topic and the other country don't do that. For example, Egypt is the only North African country which has done a legislation against human smuggling, controlling human smuggling. The other countries don't do that, which means what happens, we have measured the effects of this legislation from Egypt, moving human smuggling to Morocco and Spain because of the legislation. So in some ways, this legislation could be negative if it's producing loopholes where criminals come. It could be very positive if this is calling other countries to do the same kind of interventions. So it explains to you what displacement means. And this opens the door to what they could be supranational interventions. And after there are many other kinds of displacement I can show you, which are in the report and the presentation of PowerPoint I'm doing. The same example I've done for Egypt is about Italy for the enforcement policy about human smuggling. You can measure the effects as we have done in the report. From 1 month to the other, when the Italian government has been intervening about human smuggling, closing the door, opening the door, what happens in the territories? You can see all these maps, it's a very small screen, but all these maps, what is displacement effect, which has been doing in this human smuggling in Egypt and in many other countries, in Libya and Morocco included. Of course, also enforcement policies are very relevant for enforcing. More police you have in an area, police is enforcing, people move from one place to the other. The same thing happened in Libya and many other countries. If you put on a line all those interventions that has been done in the last 5 years, you see how they move because of these interventions, which means it's a very good suggestion to policymakers. Pay attention, don't intervene alone, but make an agreement in intervening together, because it could be extremely dangerous if you are alone about. On the end of the story, there is a lot of displacement and also, let me say, these are the data, convergence. The research report explains that there is not much convergence. Convergence is in those territories where there is a lot of illicit trade. Here, it's very random. There is convergence between human smuggling, there is convergence between human smuggling and drug trafficking, between human smuggling, drug trafficking, and illicit cigarettes trade. There is a lot oil, there are a lot of things, but all these things happen because the criminals have quite a good know-how how to treat these illicit trades. So there is no really a mature convergence between these kind of crimes. And you can see that enforcement has a very key role in provoking and or reducing the convergence between different crimes. Of course, remember my first slide, fragility of the state, lack institutions, lack of crime control are in favor of creating opportunity for illicit trade. And these are the key concepts which come with some relevant policy implications the report is outlining. Better data we need, international coordination will reduce the asymmetries, and just because we have been speaking about human smuggling strategies, this is really important that you open some legal issues, some legal tracks for human smuggling. This will reduce the amount of crime. And enforcement operations should be done supranational. This is the methodology we have been using, open data platform. There is not many data available in the area, so we've been capturing a lot of data coming to the different elements. This is the methodology we've been using for those people who are very familiar with open source data and methodology. And this is the book which is coming out from Springer as a result of the project. Thanks a lot. These were 7 minutes, and I hope I've been in kind time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Savona. I was particularly interested in the comment that you make about how criminality seeks opportunities for business, like any other business. You know, it's like growing any kind of business. You look for opportunities, just as terrorism looks for opportunities. There was an opportunity in Afghanistan. Syndicate was established, it was dismantled, and it's moving elsewhere. And I think this has a huge impact for the Sahel region as a growth area where there are huge opportunities for both criminality and terrorism to coexist and reinforce each other. As you said, one works helping the other perpetuate itself. The final panelist here is Dr. Chloé Berger, who is a faculty advisor and researcher at the NATO Defense College here in Rome. And her work focuses on MENA and NATO's agenda for the South. She has held different positions in the French educational system, in different institutions in Syria and in Egypt. And she has worked as a consultant on risk analysis in the MENA region. So, Chloé, I'd like to hear what you have to say about the kinds of strategies that the Euro-Atlantic institutions can do in a situation like the Sahel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. So first of all, I would like to thank, of course, the NDC Foundation. It's always a pleasure to take part to that, and I think that our general, earlier in the morning, express how much it's important for the college to support the NDC Foundation. I think that the NDC Foundation always, organize very timely events. So I have been tasked to look a bit at, I would say the NATO part. I will focus more on the NATO part rather than EU, because that's not, the organization I belong to. Small disclaimer, I will speak only on my personal quality as Chloe. My colleagues from the NATO HQ later will, provide a more, I would say, institutional perspective. So the question is, why at the moment is that important for NATO to look at what is happening in the Sahel? Look at it to the point that in the last communique in June, allies have agreed to mention it in the communique and so to voice their concerns, but also, to initiate a reflection about what NATO could eventually do. So for historical reasons, I guess that Dr. Ghazini has well explained that probably there is a connection between what happened in Libya and the instability that we witness in the Sahel. So from that point of view, it's of course a matter of concern for NATO and NATO allies, I would say at least since a decade. It's also a matter of concern because a lot of allies have historical presence, okay, in that region. Now the question is that why NATO is so concerned at that precise moment, because obviously what is happening has direct implications on the security of the alliance. So stability of the Mediterranean, I think that migration flows, illicit trafficking activities, organized crime. And so this has an impact in the Mediterranean. The fact that we see Russian expansion in the Med, and that Russia is trying, but it's not the only country, to use Libya as a springboard to penetrate the Sahel is also a matter of concern for NATO. And finally, terrorist activities, or I would say, this mix of terrorism, organized crime, and probably armed militancy is a kind of, I would say, environment, or it provides instability that, also threaten allies' interest in the region. So it's about NATO, but it's about also the allies' interest in the region. So the question is that how can NATO address that? So first of all, I think that we have all understood that all the dimensions are interconnected. So what has consequences in the Med? So migration has obviously root causes. Sometimes, not at all time, because North Africa countries they have their own issues. Okay, but it has root causes in the Sahel and sometimes further to south, sub-Saharan Africa. So there are huge problems of governance. Okay, unaddressed grievances, and so this has created actually a favorable or breeding ground for the development of jihadist groups. But obviously, there were existing preconditions, okay, that were favorable for the development of violence. So now, how do you address that? The international community has actually tried and implemented many initiatives, and so most of them. They are following the same pattern, which is security development, approach. It's comprehensive approach, as we know, classical one. We have tried it in Afghanistan, and that's quite. Yeah, that's quite. I won't say funny, but ironic that every time we speak now about Sahel, we come back to Afghanistan. So there are obviously a lot of lessons to be drawn from the comprehensive approach, or the Western approach to crisis management. So one thing that I have observed personally is the fact that this, security development patterns is not working. Why? Because it's mainly driven by Western priorities, and so this is not, necessarily, connected with local population aspirations or main, problems. When we are speaking about governance, it's probably more urgent, and our colleague said it, than, fighting terrorism. So there is a disconnection here that is extremely important to be addressed. Then you have, beyond that, if we speak from a purely security military point of view, you have operations that are conducted with, limited forces. And so the problem is that look at the huge areas that have to be covered. Rules of engagement implies to have, one man to cover, thousands of square kilometers. So this is, really a strong challenge. Then we can, of course, have forces conducting, precise strikes and cleaning areas where you have jihadists. But the problem is that if the state does not deploy any personnel, the vacuum is, easily filled by local actors, but also international actors. And I think that it's an important point here. So this is more or less, part of the conundrum. Last dimension that for me, and I'm coming back to this disconnection between what are the priorities of the West and what are the priorities, local priorities, is the fact that actually, when it comes to governance, okay, most of the time you need to approach the state to deploy in these areas that have been totally, marginalized for ages. And so the problem is that you have conflict, okay, and the state is not providing any arbitrage or mechanism, okay, to, build trust and confidence with the population. So this is a huge problem, and most of the international community initiatives focus on delivering assistance or infrastructure. But building this relationship and actually, I would say, linking again the population to the state is not done. And so obviously we are, recycling turning into the same cycle. So what could be done? From a NATO perspective, of course, NATO could have a role as support, but obviously not as a lead. Okay, NATO is not equipped to address the root causes in terms of governance. EU is much more, suitable for that. UN too, and African Union. I think that again, here to have, local partners, but also regional actors, it's extremely important to have legitimacy, and this is a key, a key question. What can NATO do? It's to obviously support and foster the interoperability of Sahelian armed forces and security forces. And so from a training perspective, also providing, what we call defense capacity building packages. This is something that NATO can do. In terms of professional military education, it's also super important if you want to have these forces, to act to interoperate together. Then I think that we need to build on what is already, present in the region. So allies have already, operations, and so we need to build on that to capitalize. So NATO support to Takuba force, I think that it would make sense. And so this is more or less what I can see. Now the question is that how you interconnect NATO, EU, AU, that's probably, a political problem. But on the tactical or on the technical level, I think that we can do things. If we were able to align, for example, trust funds, of both organizations, so EU will end a project, but the project needs to be continued. And guess what? NATO has some fund to continue that. And I think that from that perspective, in the Sahel, you have a lot of opportunities for NATO and EU to align. And so probably it's something that, the next, NATO summit should give a new impetus, to this NATO-EU cooperation. And I think the Sahel offers a lot of new opportunities. And I will stop here.
So thank you. You've confirmed that the Sahel is a region for opportunities for criminals, for NATO, for...
we would prefer that, for NATO rather than criminals.
Absolutely. But you do raise a very interesting point that I hope that we will address in our discussion now, which is NATO part of the problem or part of the solution? And I think this is, if we come back to the question of the Afghanistan experience, there's a record to look back, and I think, if I can say, without wanting to preempt the discussion, there are some lessons to be learned from Afghanistan. And when we look at the Sahel, we have to see, is the approach perhaps different? The objective might be the same, but the way of getting there may have to be reviewed and changed. Before we, well, first of all, thank you to all the presenters, all incredibly succinct and to the point and within the time, which is always highly appreciated. I think the setups here with these timers and screens really helps people keep the time, so it makes my job a lot easier. We've got 20 minutes for some discussion, and I wanted to start with, before we go into a deep, very contextualized kind of question, I want to start with a simple question, and I want to address it to you, Dr. Sambe. It's something that struck me when I first read the name of this session, which was looking at the Deep Maghreb. And in your presentation, you talked about the Sahel, which is how I have always referred to the region. I mean, it's a very clear geographic zone on the borders of the Sahel, but below the Maghreb. Now, obviously, historically, there has been always a lot of interchange between the two regions. And as I said earlier, the impact of the crisis in Libya had a huge impact on the development of crime and armed militant groups. What do you think? Do you think that that is an appropriate name, the Deep Maghreb? Is it a misleading name? Is it a helpful name? Do you have any ideas on that?
Okay, when we have found the Timbuktu Institute African Center for Peace Studies, it was to talk about peace and security in the region and to promote the indigenous solution from our country and to help our European and Arab partners to listen to the field. Because we are always suffering from the two phenomenon from some regions or some stakeholders who are talking in our names. From the Western countries, some Western countries who speak in our names in the Security Council, in everywhere, in the European Union. And from Africa, our partners also who think that they have to Islamize the African, even they are Muslim. You know, the destruction of the mausoleum in Timbuktu with a kind of strategy to say, okay, you are not really pure Muslim. We want to Islamize you. We are suffering from these two problems, and now more and more, some countries in the Maghreb consider themselves as the representative of the African. We are the gate of Africa. Come with us, and we go to Africa. You can come to Africa directly, as said my colleague, and we don't need to be under tutelage or the intermediary of any country in the Maghreb. We have very nice relationship with Morocco, with Algeria. But what I realize is that when people, even within the European Union programs, when they want to deal with the Sahel, they go by the Maghreb, and after we go to the Sahel. No, in the Saharan countries, you have stakeholders, you have research centers, you have people who are thinking about what is happening in the continent, and they don't need that. So anyway, I'm for the synergy of solution. I say that the Sahelan crisis need everyone, but sometimes we need them together. For example, in the Sahel, we have more than 19 strategies, Sahel strategies. No one of these strategies was designed in the Sahel. They were designed abroad and imposed on the ground. We need now to co-construct. We need now to be considered as a region where you can have counterpart, we can discuss without intermediary in the Maghreb, in the Arab world, or in the Western country, but to talk to the civil society, to talk to understand the real situation by taking into account our specificities and our realities.
Okay, so how does that answer my question? In terms of the use of these terms, are you saying that Deep Maghreb is okay as a term because it explains this close interrelationship, or you prefer the historical separation?
Because in the Maghreb, some of them belong to the League of Arab States. They consider themselves as Arab, yeah, in spite of their belonging to the African Union. We have other realities. We are not Deep Maghreb, so we have a continuum from the Maghreb to the Sahel. I say that the Sahara Desert has never been an irreachable barrier, but an inland sea which invite to go from one shore to other shore. It's like that can you understand that if you call the Maghreb the deep Europe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well.
You can understand the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. As well, you have, just as you have connections from the Maghreb to Sahel, you have also from the Sahel to sub-Saharan Africa.
Anyway, I thank you very much to invite us to come here and to discuss with you.
Yeah.
Sometime, and many times, some institution from some Maghrebian country come and talk in our names without knowing very well our realities, and it is. I congratulate you to do that.
Okay. Well, then maybe, if you don't mind, unless someone really has something strong to say about that, I want to ask a question that I think is relevant for all of the speakers here. And we've talked about it a little bit so far, is about the Afghan experience, which I think Afghanistan was a hugely traumatic experience, not just for NATO, but for organizations like the EU, as well as the AU, that have been working in conflictual areas, trying to present an alternative model based on good governance, based on developing institutions, based on human development programs, job development, etc. What is the experience in Afghanistan going to leave for what is happening right now in the Sahel? Is it something that we can learn lessons from, or is it something qualitatively different? Is it it's an experience which is unique, which has nothing to do with an Afghan experience, and I think it's an important question because it helps us address the question which is at the basis of this panel, which is what are the solutions for trying to deconflict an increasingly conflictual and increasingly brutal situation in the Sahel. Dr. Berger, would you like to take a stab at that?
So again, that's my personal view. So I think that, there is always limitations in trying to compare two different, situations, which have, culturally speaking, geopolitically speaking, I can multiply, the layers. Their specificity, okay? There is a specific context. Nevertheless, here, I think that we can draw some lessons if we speak about, the comprehensive approach and the crisis management approach, okay? Meaning that we have a certain approach with tools extra. So this is basically our toolbox when we approach crisis, okay? And from a NATO perspective, when we approach crisis, meaning what we call the out-of-area operations, so outside, the NATO's area of responsibility. So from that point of view, from an institutional perspective, yes, you can question, operational efficiency. That's totally okay. So what probably is interesting is to understand to which extent, okay, we can import solutions that are already, I would say, standardized.
Pre-made.
Pre-made.
But you call it a toolbox, which already presupposes that it is made.
But an institution has, we have a certain set of forces as countries, and so we cannot multiply that. You need to do also with the resources that you have. So to a certain extent, this, of course, will frame our approach. Now the question is, if you take different layers, political decision. So to which extent, when we craft an end state, okay, we have to craft an end state that, implies good governance or democratic institutions. So that's a real question. So are we, planning to import or to export, democracy? I think that NATO has learned some lessons from that point of view. Now, going beyond that, mission creep. That is something that in any stabilization mission, operation abroad, happens. So the question is that, can you import solutions, okay, to sustain a government, but at what time can you live? And so what are the conditions to set the departure? That's probably very difficult to say. So in the Sahel, the question is that, okay, obviously, now Barkhane, I'm French, so I will take on that. So now, Barkhane has been asked to leave, okay? But at the same time, now that Barkhane is done, scaling the operation, Malian government is saying, okay, you are abandoning us. So, here there is also a problem of you need to rely on partners, and these partners need also to, bring their share. Okay, so in terms of governance, there is probably a part of, I don't know if it's political conditionality, but you need to have incentives, okay? To have, the government deploying also personnel and etc.
You have to have a shared vision with the government, the host governments too, don't you?
Sorry?
You have to have a shared vision with the G5 governments.
So you need to rely on, actually, I would say, I would suggest a community-based approach. Why? Because from my point of view, we have other cases that have shown that instead of having this top-bottom approach, okay, you probably go for, resuming activities, providing security to the population, and so from the strength and resilience of the population, you build on that for institution. And so you go there.
Okay.
I will stop here.
That's okay, thank you. Sounds like the same toolbox as Afghanistan, but Dr. Savona?
I did not answer to the question of the conference if Sahel was becoming a new Afghanistan, because I think that Afghanistan, we don't know what will happen in the next few months. So it is impossible for me to say Sahel is 11 countries, it's a region. Afghanistan is one country with one government. There is a lot of difference between the two. What I think, if you look to what is happening in Afghanistan today, tomorrow, or yesterday, going to Moscow, you see that this situation will be mainly driven by us. So Afghanistan depends on what the other countries will do. There are two main issues which is very relevant. The economic issues, remember that Afghanistan has the 90% of the drug trafficking, heroin trafficking to all the world, which means if these people need money, they know where to find the money. And this will be a disaster for the international community, so they play a game. The other one is about terrorist game, which means yesterday, a minister of the government of Afghanistan, it's compensating the family of the kamikaze, you know the story, because they lost a member. So this is a signal very bad in terms of legitimizing the terrorists. These are very bad symptoms, but there could be also good symptoms. It's to us and to the governments not conflicting each other, but being unified by supranational organizations, could be UN or NATO or others, in order to determine what Afghanistan is going to be in the next few months and year. So that means that today we are completely unable to say if Sahel will become a new Afghanistan, because we don't know what will be the new Afghanistan.
Yeah, okay, I think it's fair to say we mean an absence of law and order when we talk about Afghanistan. Dr. Razini, would you like to?
I'll be very brief. Yes, there's one direct correlation between Afghanistan and Libya, and that's the UN's role. Let me tell you why. The new UN mediators, and the UN has an important role in Libya in trying to mediate for the past years between the various factions. It was responsible for the formation of the new government last year and has really been in the driver's seat. Now we have a new special envoy, a new group of heads of mission that come from the Afghan experience. And their mantra seems to be, foreign imposed solutions will never work based on the Afghan experience. And so they're applying this also in their mediation strategy in Libya, which is, let's take a step back and let's let local actors sort things out by themselves. So that means less proactive mediation and more subserviency to Libyan-led solutions.
So facilitating,
right? Oh, which in theory is great, right? You return agency to the local actors and so on. But in practical terms, it can be really dangerous because the feuds between rival factions have not finished. What we have is a temporary government, interim government that is supposed to just transition the country towards a more permanent post-election phase. And when you say, let's give Libyan agency to the Libyan actors, there's the risk of those Libyan actors strategizing to stay in power and not being able to resolve these emerging tensions and feuds that we see year over year come up again. So this is the direct sort of effect of the Afghan experience on the Libya peace process. It's returning Libyan agency, but at a risk, from my point of view.
I think that it's very interesting because it seems to be a very much agreed concept that most of the armed violence and jihadist groups that are working in the Sahel and other regions as well, not just in the Sahel, are motivated primarily by local grievances. That you can bring in actors from all over the world and they will use opportunities to further crime. They'll use opportunities to further their ideology. But if you don't have local grievances on which to build that and to exploit, you're not going to, your opportunities are going to be extremely limited. So this will certainly have an impact, as you say, in a country like Libya. Dr. Sambe, if you would like to say a few words on that, we've got a couple of minutes left.
Yes, about the comparison between the Sahel and Afghanistan. You know, yes, the Sahel is a region with many countries, like we have groups in Burkina Faso, we have in Niger, and in Mali as well. But I don't think it's not the same culture, neither the same culture nor the same Islam, and the Taliban. We have not the Taliban movement was a national movement with national grievance and as made. The other thing is, but there is a psychological consequences of what happened in Afghanistan, in Africa. The last speech from Iyad Aghali, who is the leader of the GSEM, the Group de Soutien à l'Islam JNIM, he said that there is something very interesting. He said that 2 days before Kabul was under the Taliban rule, they say, now it is clear that we don't need any kind of compromise to achieve our goal. The only way we have is to combat against the secular state, against democracy.
And against foreign intervening
powers. From intervening. And that's why I have real doubt about the success of the dialogue between the Malian government. From yesterday, they say now they open dialogue with the terrorist group and the terrorist group, because the situation has changed within the Afghan storytelling and also within the intermediate they can use. And the argument of the people in Mali, once you know that French is quietly opposite to any dialogue between Bamako and the jihadi group, people say, okay, we cannot understand how this country, France, can be opposite to any dialogue against the terrorist group, and they have sent a delegation in Doha to meet the Taliban.
Yeah. No. Good. Our session is finished in terms of what we have to say. I'm not sure, do we have time to take questions from the floor now? Yes? We do. Okay. No, we don't. We don't. Okay. I'm sorry, sir, we don't have any more time. Let me thank all of the panelists here for... I wish we could have had more time. Thank you. Wish we could have had more time to take questions from the floor, but unfortunately, we had so many interesting things to say. Thank you all.
So, ladies and gentlemen, well, after this very interesting panel, with the able chairmanship of our friend coming from Geneva, I thank you very much for your management of the session, but thanks to everybody. Now the final speaker, the final remark will be given by Giovanni Romani. I have the pleasure to introduce him, an old-time friend and colleague, because I was also part of the international staff for a few years. And now he is the head of the Middle East and North Africa section in NATO headquarters in Brussels. And I don't envy him in a way, because he has a lot of issues to think about. And of course, he is not the owner of the place, because there are 30 member countries around. So, Giovanni, you have the floor. You're very welcome.
Mille grazie, Ambasciatore, and a big thank you to the NATO Defense College Foundation for organizing this once again important and timely discussion. So I had two challenges now. The first is, as actually Chloe was referring to convey where NATO stands regarding all the complex issues we've been discussing so far. And the second is to leverage your patience and resilience, being the last speaker of the day. So that's why you don't envy me, I guess, as well. As we heard, over the afternoon, there's a widening array of security threats, challenges, factors. Let me mention aggressive disinformation campaigns, conflict spillovers from fragile and failing states, instability in Sahel and Iraq, multiplication of transnational terrorist cells belonging to Daesh, Al-Qaeda, illegal trafficking, the role of Russia, China, Iran, just to mention a few. These are not only factors affecting nations in the region and individualized, but they ultimately affect NATO as such as well. So one of the elements of NATO's success over its life of over 70 years is that it adapts when the world changes. And discussion among allies are part of NATO's DNA on sensitive topics, and there's no shying away from it, including on the complex issues we've been discussing today. We also involve our partners in this discussion and in tackling these challenges. And also, we try to engage as much as possible other international organizations and regional organizations and initiatives. Where NATO has some direct experience, for example, is in building knowledge in the threat posed by Russia. And today we heard a lot of it, and you probably are aware of the fact that early this week, Russia announced the closure of its mission to NATO and of our offices in Moscow as well. So NATO regrets this decision. It doesn't promote dialogue and mutual understanding. The policy of NATO remains consistent. So we have a track of remaining open to dialogue with Russia, including through the NATO-Russia Council. At the same time, we will continue to assess how we can further strengthen our deterrence and defense, because Russia remains a peer competitor for NATO. So both Russia and China, and I would add Iran, are strategic competitors in MENA as well. Although we cannot put them on the same situation. Russia, definitely a strategic competitor. China, a rising power. Iran, even a different situation for Iran. And as you know, the NATO's approach to MENA is part of our cooperation security. It's one of the three main tasks of the alliance, alongside those of collective self-defense and crisis management. This, somebody mentioned NATO 2030. This actually fits into the NATO Secretary General NATO 2030 initiative objectives, which are essentially to keep NATO strong military, to make it stronger politically, and of interest today, for what we heard, to ensure NATO takes an even more global approach. We are not starting from scratch when it comes to the South, and NATO 2030 builds on significant achievements. For example, our long-standing partnership with Mediterranean dialogue countries, 27 years. Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, 17 years. Actually, the ambassador has been on the driving seat to establish the ICI, so we're grateful to him for this. All this helped NATO better understand the security environment and also to face together with our partners the challenges that were being described today. And we're more and more trying to draw a more tailored approach for individual countries that will help us tackle these challenges better together. More recently, in the Brussels summit in 2021, it was held in June, the leaders agreed to strengthen our political dialogue and practical cooperation with our MD and ICI partners to contribute to building stronger security and defense institutions and capacity and to collaborate on countering terrorism. And NATO is continuously improving the quality of our cooperation through training, education, facilitating interoperability of respective forces, and providing better support to our defense and capacity building initiatives, for example, in Tunisia, in Jordan, by enhancing our efforts in Iraq, where we have a mission and we focus on advice and training. We also further leverage our NATO Istanbul Cooperation Initiative Regional Center, which is in Kuwait. It's a hub for education and training and public diplomacy activity. And more than 1,000 officers from all 6 GCC countries have actually gone through the activities of the center so far. NATO is also seeking to expand its public diplomacy activities in MENA. It's critical for us to reach out to the audiences of these countries, particularly the young audiences, not always easy, and communicate NATO's values, objectives, and role in the region. There are more structures than NATO that support our work. You heard today from the NATO Defense College, but let me also mention the Hub for the South, established in 2017, which contributes to the Alliance strategic awareness. NATO is committed to the international community's fight against terrorism. We contribute to these global efforts through several means, providing alliance with awareness and analysis, enhancing our preparedness and responsiveness to terrorist threats, and working on our capabilities, partnerships, and also through NATO and ally-led operations. Terrorism is one of the most pressing security challenges of our times, and NATO is part of the global coalition against Daesh. We also offer crucial support to our MENA partners on counter-ID capabilities, border security, and information exchange. Let me move to Iraq, where we have a NATO training mission, and this is a substantial effort of NATO in partnering with Iraq in the fight against terrorism. The aim is to strengthen Iraqi security forces and institutions so that they can prevent the return of Daesh and stabilize the country. It's a non-combat mission and fully integrates civil and military personnel, working closely with other international actors on the ground. NATO's mission in Iraq has recently been expanded, though contrary to what has often been reported in the media, the expansion is demand-driven, incremental, scalable, and based on conditions on the ground and on the request of the government. About the African continent, the deteriorating security situation in the Sahel and the terrorist threat destabilizing several nations in the region affects the transatlantic security. And you must have noticed that for the very first time, a summit declaration actually includes a paragraph on Sahel, the latest in June. NATO will continue to engage in dialogue with partners and international regional organizations about the Sahel, such as the African Union, the UN, the EU, and in particular the G5 Sahel. So you heard from Chloe about the NATO Defense College. Actually, I led a visit to the G5 Sahel and to Mauritania in June. Actually, she was part of this. I actually wanted to even ask a question about would NATO be welcome in the Sahel? Maybe we'll have this discussion over dinner. But for the moment, our focus is to engage through Mauritania which is a country with which we have a 27-year-old partnership, and through the G5 Sahel. This is the initial approach. Let me add a word on climate change. It is a growing field of cooperation. The Secretary General has repeatedly underlined the impact of climate change on security. That is the angle we're looking at from a NATO perspective. And this is particularly important for the countries in the MENA region. Consider that a couple of years ago, we were looking at climate change only from the perspective of a new passage opened in the north. So we were not looking at desertification, water scarcity, and so on. And now, actually, there is a more global focus. Our discussion with the MENA partners on this subject it has started. It is ongoing, so we think this is going to be another topic that we will tackle together. Finally, let me address the two elephants in the room, Libya and Afghanistan. Very sensitive both, as you can imagine, and NATO. So, as we all recognize, the crisis in Libya has a direct implication for the regional stability and for the security of the allies, including because of the presence of global powers in the country, as you can imagine, which is a concern to NATO. Our stance is clear. We welcome the progress achieved in Libya in the last few months, support a Libyan-led, Libyan-owned political process aimed at promoting national reconciliation, as well as unifying and strengthening state institutions. NATO allies called the Libyan authorities and institutions to implement the Libyan Political Dialogue Forum roadmap and to make the necessary preparation for free, fair, inclusive presidential and parliamentary election on December 24, hopefully. As well as NATO supports the Security Council resolutions 2570 to 2571. As we heard in the last panel, and I confirm to you, NATO is not in Libya. It is a political decision which allies are not ready to take. If you read the summit communique, there is a paragraph on Libya that basically explains more or less what I just mentioned. My personal opinion is that this engagement among allies will restart once we have an elected government, and at that point, NATO will look into what is possible to do. For the moment, with my colleagues, I'm fully involved in this. We actually were in Tripoli as well a couple of weeks ago for discussions, sorry, not in Tripoli, I meant in Tunis, for discussion about Libya. So we're working on it, but more through the eyes of what can NATO do so that we can present something to the allies. But the political situation is not mature yet for that. In a post-election scenario, maybe we can look into this. The other question I would have asked is, would NATO be welcome in Libya? Again, I will ask tonight over dinner. So, however, we remain committed to providing advice to Libya upon its request in the areas of defense, security, institution building, taking into account political and security conditions. If you look at the declaration of the summit 2018, actually, NATO had already said this. We didn't implement it because of the security and political conditions on the ground. Afghanistan. What has happened in recent months is a tragedy for the Afghan people, and that's heartbreaking for all of us who have been engaged, including me. I've been there a couple of times. We were hoping for a more positive outcome. NATO went to Afghanistan over 20 years ago to prevent the country from serving as a safe haven for terrorists who could threaten our own countries. And over the past 20 years, no terrorist attack against NATO countries has been organized from Afghanistan. We will not forget our Afghan friends. As you have followed closely, I'm sure, this last August, NATO allies organized in extremely difficult and dangerous circumstances one of the largest airlift in history from Kabul airport, evacuating more than 120,000 people. Actually, we were involved as well. As you probably know, most of this went through the countries in the Gulf, which were our responsibility, so we've been very much involved in making this happen. So we must and will continue to bring others to safety, other Afghans which helped us during our time there, together with the rest of the international community. We make clear that the Taliban must live up to their obligations, including safe passage, human rights, and terrorism. We do have leverage still, including financial and economic tools, and the power to isolate the Taliban diplomatically. And the world is watching and will judge the Taliban based on their actions and not their words. Now, we just discussed this in the previous panel. What happened in Afghanistan is something that deserves a very in-depth reflection. And there's an ongoing assessment in NATO about the lesson learned. So this might change, actually, the way we conduct out-of-area operations. So I expect for this, actually, to modify the way NATO acts where we are in this kind of situation. And that's actually the debate that happened before. But there are a number of additional elements that are playing now, and I just want to mention them all. So, besides the reflection on Afghanistan, allies have recently decided to develop a new strategic concept. The current one was developed in 2010. So pre-invasion of Korea, pre-Afghanistan, pre a number of things, and the strategic concept need to be refreshed to drive NATO for the next 10 or 15 years. Consider that this is the second most important document that drives NATO's activities, second only to the Atlantic Treaty. Also, we have NATO 2030, which is a reflection process, has been mentioned a number of times. One of the things that this will bring is also objectives and resources associated to the objectives that the NATO will want to pursue. And we have a summit in June in Madrid, which has been announced 2 weeks ago. It's a summit that will also look south. So we expect a certain political push and drive for summit deliverables associated to the MENA, particularly to Africa, I think, but I hope to the MENA in general. So with all these things coming together, I expect that by the end of June, you will see a different NATO, which will have adapted with a new approach to the MENA, hopefully, and to partnership in general. A new direction of travel, which will actually take into account the outcome of all these processes that I just described. So with this, sorry. Okay, there is one last point I want to add, which is in all this process, which will be also about assessing challenges, threats, and so on, the alliance will also have to take into account not acting in isolation, but actually taking into account what every single ally is doing, and to the maximum extent in coordination with international organizations. Primarily the UN, but also the EU, the African Union, and other regional organizations. The GCC was mentioned today, G5 Sahel, ECOWAS. There are a number of international organizations, particularly in the region, with which we need to enhance our engagement. So with all this, I close by thanking again the ambassador, because of course, with all these processes, we also have parallel engagements which help us pick the brain of think tanks, academia, and conferences like this give us an opportunity to actually get new ideas, engage with experts. So we're very grateful for this because I came with colleagues also, and we gained a very good additional insight on a number of issues. So thanks again, and looking forward to the conference next year. Thank you.
Ambasciatore, I think I should call you this way. You gave us the big picture, I was to say. Thank you for that. I think that we have closed the conference. It has been a very intense day, I think, for all of us, because we have tried to focus on important issues and to try to be comprehensive, I mean, and comprehensible as well, which is very difficult. I don't know if we have succeeded in that, but certainly there is a lot of work behind this day, and I want to thank you, my collaborators, who really have been late at night to work for this. I thank you for your presence. I thank you for being here. I hope that you have enjoyed the conversation I had. And let's keep in touch and have a good evening. Grazie mille a tutti. Buonasera.